according to Krishna, because they are divine scripture, Shruti. They are not written by man, but they are some kind of divine intervention. So although they are poetry, but we don't have the authorship to comment on that. According to Krishnamurti, in the period after the Vedic period, some intellectual disciplines, namely Shastras, uh, were kind of aid to understand Veda. Etymology and grammar, Nirukta and Vyakaran, among them contain some incidental references to poetic devices like simile, upma, besides a few citations from folk ballads or lyrics. And he mentions Patanjali here, that he testifies to the aesthetic significance of the term rasa when he speaks of the actor in drama as Rasik, and also names a few folk tales, Akhyayikas, popular in his time, such as Vasavadatta and Kumanottara. He mentions next the Buddhist canonical work Kavi Sutta in Pali about four types of poets: meditative poets, Chinta Kavi, Chinta Kavi. Second is scholarly, Satta Kavi. Third is inspired, Patibha, Patibhana Kavi. And fourth is missionary, Atha Kavi. The treatment of prosody by Pingala as well as Bharat reveals numerous classical measures based on quantity as well as stress. The classical Kavya style are found as early as the Christian era, 150 Anno Domini. They expressly mentions prose and poetry, Gadya and Padya. Literary excellences such as clarity, Sphutita, and sweetness, Madhurya, as well as figures of speech, Alankara. All these evidence indicates that the cultivation of different genres of poetry and drama went hand in hand with speculations of speculations on literary criticism round about the Christian era. But none of these early attempts is available to us today. Krishnamurti next mentions Ramayana and Mahabharata as itihasa and the legendary history, as well as the ideal ethical precept, dharma. The Ramayana and Mahabharata embodies the legendary history as well as dharma. Hence, ancient Indian poetics, Alankara Shastra, generally leaves them out of account. And even if they are mentioned or alluded to once in a way, it is only to derive support from their example and not from their precept on literary theory. Next, Krishnamurti mentions Natya Shastra by Bharat Muni, and it is kind of encyclopedia on dramaturgy, his, histrionics, dance, music, etc. But the mention of poetry and the theory of poetry is very cursory in Natya Shastra. Still, it gives almost kind of evolutionary concepts of Sanskrit criticism. And the theories and concepts given by Bharat in Natya Shastra is going to be influential in next 16 centuries. He gave concepts such as Rasa Bhava, Auchitya, Gun, Dosh, Alankar, Vritti, and other literary genres. In domain of drama, however, its treatment is most exhaustive, and its norms regarding plot, characters, sentiments, and style in as many as 10 types of plays have remained basically unaltered even after the lapse of so many centuries. The names and nature of Sanskrit poetics. So Krishnamurti writes that usually all early writers on subject Bhama, Bhama, Dandin, Vamana, Udbhat, and Rudrata called their treatise by the name Kavyalankar or Kavya, Kavya Lakshana, the embellishment or hallmark of poetry. Some earlier names which are known only by references are Kriyakalpa and Kriyavidhi, which means rules of the poetic art. The designation Sahitya Vidya, theory of literature, is later one. It emphasizes the perfect concord of sound, shabda, and sense, artha, as the sine qua non of literature. But the latest and commonly used Alankar Shastra, science of beauty, because the word Alankar in Sanskrit means not only a means of beautification, but also beauty itself. This usage became current when poetics adopted the scientific methodology and terminology of allied discipline like grammar, prosody, dramaturgy, erotics, logic, and philosophy in the discussion of its basic concepts, especially after Anandavardhan, who was a philosopher of the first rank, besides being masterly poet critic, and who for the first time gave in his aesthetic theory of Dhwani an equal status to drama and poetry, and who blazed the trail for applied or practical criticism of not only select literary pieces but also whole works. So Krishnamurti here says that he denotes all the criticism, literary criticisms chronologically, starting from uh, 600, the century 600, the year 600, then 700 and 750 and following.
The C stands for Sarka, means around 7th century. Right? It's not exact 600. So Sarka means around.
Around that time, yes. So after Anandavardhana gave his influential concept of Dhwani, which is kind of implied or suggested meaning, uh, which I think we also learned in uh, structuralism, like, like words in isolation means something else, but when we study the whole sentence or the whole stanza or the stanza of poem, there is also another meaning which is implied or suggested meaning. And this concept gave poetry an equal status to that of drama. And he further, Krishnamurti further writes that Anandavardhana's original insights and illuminating observations paved the way for an age of systematization, which includes celebrated names like Kuntaka, Ammata, Vidyantha, Vidyantha, Vidyanatha, Vishwanatha, and Jagannatha. And four, these five authors were studied exhaustively in Indian aesthetics and criticism. Next, Krishnamurti lists all the literary genres prevalent in those days. The major literary genres or kavya forms mentioned by Bhama are art epic in several cantos, Mahakavya, drama, Abhinayartha, prose chronicle, Akhyayika, romantic tale, Katha, and smaller verse units or single self-contained verses, Anibadha. To these should be added Kampu or mixed composition in ornate prose and verse on an exalted theme, first mentioned by Dandin. From time to time, further subdivisions came to be noted, especially under Katha and Anibadha. Under Katha, there are Upakhyan, an episodic story in larger work, Akhyan, an episodic story sung and enacted by a bard, Nidarshana, didactic bird and beast fable like that of Panchatantra and Jatak Katha, Prava, Pravalhika, Pravalhika, a story in dialogue form, Patalika, a story satirizing society, Manikulya, Manikulya, a story involving an initial puzzle, Parikatha, a tale narrating several adventures, Khandakatha, a partially narrated well-known story, Sakala a complete story of hero's life, Upakatha, an incidentally recounted story, and Brihat Katha, a vast repository of tales. Under Anibadha, small verse units, there are Muktaka, a self-contained stanza, Sanda, Sandanitaka, Sandanitaka, two run-on stanzas, Visheshaka, three run-on stanzas, Kalapakka, four run-on stanzas, Pulaka, 4 to 14 run-on stanzas, Kosha, anthology of independent verse composed by oneself and or others, Shataka, century, and Panchashika, 50 verses. No, 50 poems, I think. Samgata, a short poem by a poet on a single subject consisting of several stanzas. And last is Samhita, a collection of poems on different subjects. Again, we have a number of divisions under the head of light literature or Shudra Prabandha in later works. They are Udaharana, alliterative and rhythmic prose, paragraph with metrical beginning and end, Chakravala, rhyme, rhythmic prose paragraph following an initial verse, each component being a vocative and embodying the device of making the last word in a compound identical with the initial word of the text of the next. Bhogavali, prose sections of 8 or 4 uniformly structured sentences, beginning and ending with a stanza and containing the vocative form Deva, Deva at the head of each unit, and describing beauties in nature. Birudavali, eulogy, a bombastic parade of royal titles to serve as content in the form of Bhogavali above. Taravali, poem in 27 stanzas. Karambaka, a poem containing stanzas in Sanskrit as well as other languages. Ratnavali, a poem in 9 stanzas. So also drama or Rupaka has a number of types and subtypes which can be conveniently classified in tabular form. So here Krishnamurti explains that in Sanskrit literary criticism, the primary schematic and the criticism is primarily schematic and formal, and a work is first determined by which genre it belongs to. So the rules and regulations of these genres are very loose and very basic. So any work I think will inevitably belong to one of these genres. These relate to common elements which any literary analysis or appreciation of given works should perforce include: one, plot, characters, rasa and bhava; style, guna, alankara; judgment of literature, defects, anauchitya or dosha; gradations of beauty in literature, dhvani, pratibha, sahridaya; defense of poetry and criticism, vakrokti; and specimens of practical criticism. So according to Krishnamurti, these in-depth studies to study a work in this in-depth and exhaustive manner, we need to be uh, proficient in the branches of learning such as linguistics, semantics, psychology, grammar, aesthetics, logic and philosophy, and raise even the eclectic discipline of poetics. Next, Krishnamurti expands on theme and technique of plot construction. Vastu Samvidhana. So, whatever the literary genre, the theme serves as its very body or backbone. In the highest forms of poetry and drama, namely Mahakavya and Nataka, it is not so much as invented story which matters, but a plot structure in a well ordered form. The five noticeable divisions in a good plot are opening, mukha, progress, pratimukha, complication, garbha, disentanglement, vima, vimarsha, and happy conclusion, nirvahana. It will be seen that this kind of constructive skill endows an otherwise uninteresting story with suspense, surprise, and artistic appeal. The action carrier does not move along a predictable line. The progress is deliberately made uneven and crisscross till the climax. When there is a sudden turn of events, which removes the obstacles and eventually brings about the intended happy end. Corresponding to the uneven progress of the incidents, there will be uneven stages, avasthas in the endeavors of the hero before he succeeds. And these are termed arambha, commencement, effort, prayatna, possibility of gaining the end, praptya, pratyasha, pratyasha, certainly, certainty of reward, niyatapti, and successful attainment, phalagama, phalagama. Metaphorically, the main theme may be said to correspond to the seed, bija, the water drop, bindu, that nourishes it, and the fruit, phala, which two intervening accessories of subplot, namely parallel incident, pataka, and episode, prakari. Thus, in story of Rama, if Ram's coronation is regarded as the end, we first find incidents in favor of it, then unforeseen obstacle leading to complications, with possibilities of hope, with the alliance of Sugriva, certainty with the feats of Hanuman, and happy conclusion after Ravana is slain. A good plot then involves a conflict, external or internal. So, what Krishnamurti here exemplifies is the story of Ramayana, and he puts it alongside this development of plot. So, first, the end, he determines the end, which is the coronation of Rama, which is the end, like the fall, and how the plot develops. Next, he expands on the characters. So, according to Krishnamurti, characters in a literature are much of the human interest. So, we are interested in characters much more. So, according to Krishnamurti, there are three uh, kinds of characters in Indian aesthetics: high, uttama, middling, madhyama, and low, nature. Each of them has a place if they are judiciously brought in where they belong, according to the demands made by the genre. A villain, a rake, a jester, and a courtesan fit in best in low comedy like Prahasana, but would be out of place in a serious play or art epic whose loftiness demands semi-divine heroes and heroines. Realism has little scope in the rarefied atmosphere of these great and idealistic literary forms. Similarly, love lyrics are so varied in range that they demand a great diversity of maidens in love. The broad types of heroes and heroines are indicated in Alankar Shastra, provide guidelines to poets and critics. So, in heroes, the general characteristics of heroes are good manners, sweet temper, generosity, capability, lively speech, popularity, eloquence, noble birth, steadiness, youthfulness, sharp intellect, dynamism, accomplishment in the arts, heroism in battle, firmness, radiance, learning, and religiousness. There are four broad types of heroes: exalted hero, hero datta, example is Rama; bumptious hero, hero datta, hero datta, Dhirodata, Dhirodhata, Dhiro, Dhirodatta, Dhirodhatta. And the example of this bumptious hero is Bhim. Third type is sportive hero, Dhira Lalita. And the example of this type of hero is Vatsaraja. Fourth type of hero is calm hero, Dhira Shanta. And the example of this type is Charudatta. Different stages of love in the above heroes. Courteous Dakshina, one who feigns sincere love to his first wife when he is really in love with another woman. The example is Agnimitra. This discourteous Sakha, one who does not care for the feelings of the first woman. Example, love in Amaru's love poem, Amaru Shataka. Callous hero, Drish, Drishtya, one who does not care even to hide his telltale indication of guilt. Example, the lover in Amaru Shataka. Devoted, Anukul, one who is completely devoted to one woman. Example is Rama. Fourth is associates of heroes. So there is a need of the associates of heroes, the underlings of heroes, which are hero of subplot, Peethamarga. Example is Sugriv. Second is Cavalier, Vita. Example is Shekharaka in Nagananda. Third is Jester, Vidushaka. Example is Vasantaka in Swapnavasavadatta. And the fifth category is hero's rival, anti-hero, Pratinyak, Pratinayaka. Example is Ravan. So here Krishnamurti does not note Ravan as a villain, but as an anti-hero figure. Next category is of depiction of heroine. There are three types of heroine. Like Svija, example is Sita for Ram. Second type is another heroine is Anya. Example is Sita for Rama. Third type of heroines are courtesan, Sadharana Stri. Example is Vasant Sen. Subtypes of wedded wife. Guileless, Mukta. Example is Parvati, Kumar Sambhav. Second is youthfully excited, Vidya. Example is Shishu Palavada. Third is love and Pragalbha. Example is Amaru Shataka. For the classes of the last two types of women, youthfully excited and love mad, are bold, Dhira, timid, Adhira, and partly bold and partly timid. Dhira Dhira. Dhira Dhira. These six kinds, again twofold. Our first wife, Jeshta, Vasavadatta, example is Vasavadatta. And second wife, Kanishta, example is Ratnavali. Two types of another women, Anya, are one virgin and two married. Extramarital love in the main plot is strictly prohibited. However, there is no such restriction about love relating to a virgin. Sixth is eight stages of love common to all types of humans. Is one whose husband is under her control. Swadhina Pratika. Second is one who puts on her best show while receiving the lover. Vasaka Sajja. Third is one who suffers the pangs of separation. Viraha Virahotkanit Virahotkanchita. One who is jealous of her husband's extramarital love. Khanita. One who regrets her spurning the lover in flurry. Kalahantarita. One who has been deceived by her lover who misses his promised assignation. Vipralab, Vipralabdha. One whose lover is far away. Prosita Priya. One who sallies forth on her own to meet her lover. Abhisarika. Retinue of these heroines are maid servants, friends, washerwomen, half sisters, nuns, artists, etc. etc. The next category Krishnamurti denotes is Rasa and Bhava. In this, Rasa and Bhava is the most important, probably the most important parameters to analyze the work. So, according to Krishnamurti, Rasa is the essence of all literature, and it is also the end goal of a work. Rasa means sap, juice, taste, supreme joy, mental feeling, and aesthetic enjoyment. All of these shades of meaning somehow get fused in its ultimate connotation. So it is also an end to itself, the ultimate end of all literature, the highest aesthetic value, which is why it is also the hardest to describe in words, because and that's also the reason why some of the critics and analysts describes rasa as something which is beyond human capacity, something uh, spiritual. So because of that, it is nearly impossible to denote rasa, which and that's why we are denoting subcategory of this rasa, namely bhava and lower kind of rasa, which is common to all human beings. which we can analyze subjectively and objectively as well. We should talk of the vital essence as bhava and not rasa. Thus, from the ineffable heights of spiritual rasa, we come down to the level of diverse rasas and bhavas, which partake somehow of both subjectivity and objectivity. Yet these are not life emotions. They are only emotions embodied in literature or literary emotions. In life, all emotions and mental states, chittavrittis, are fleeting. But in literature, at least some emotions can be delineated in a way more abiding and lasting, and hence the term Thai Bhava is mentioned here. They are just nine, and their corresponding aesthetic counterparts are the nine rasa. The Sai Bhavas are love of sexes, rati, and its accompanying rasa is the erotic or Shringara rasa. Second is laughter or hasa rasa, hasa bhava, and its accompanying rasa is comic or hasya rasa. Third is sorrow, shoka, and its accompanying rasa is pathetic or karuna rasa. Fourth is heroic energy, utsaha, and its accompanying rasa is the heroic or veera rasa. Fifth is fear or bhaya, and its accompanying rasa is the frightful bhayanak rasa. Six is anger or krodha, and its accompanying rasa is the furious or raudra rasa. Seventh is disgust, jugupsa, and its accompanying rasa is the odious or bipatsa rasa. Eighth is wonderment, vismaya, and its accompanying rasa is marvelous or adbhuta rasa. Ninth is passion, sham, and its accompanying rasa is the tranquil or shanta rasa. According to Krishnamurti, if we look at it closely, and we can see that the names of these bhavas are nouns, and the rasas accompanying them are adjectives. That is because the rasa accompany bhava, and the rasa are the denominator of all emotional states. They are the only constant thing inside human experience, emotional experience. So, inside a work, we mainly search for the rasa, while the mental states, which are the origins of this rasa, are fleeting. And there are 33 of these other bhavas, which are very common and often accompany us while we read something poetic or something of literary value. So he denotes it as Vyabhichari Bhava. And there are 33 of this Vyabhichari Bhava. I'm not going to name all of them, but some of them are revulsion, nirveda, suspicion, shanka, jealousy, fatigue, worry, remembrance, smriti, shame, fickleness, joy, agitation, pride, forgetfulness, terror, doubt, death. Krishnamurti next explains about this Vyabhichari Bhava, that why when we mention Bhava, we almost always means Vyabhichari Bhava and not the Sthai Bhavas. The common term for Rasa and Bhava is Rasadis, and it also includes Abhas, their semblances, Udaya, their germination and Abhas of these Rasas and Bhavas, and cessation, Shanti, as well as commingling or sabarta of these Rasas and Bhavas. He next mentions Bharat Muni's Rasa Sutra. Rasa results when there is harmonious fusion of three elements in drama, namely Vibhava, Anubhava, and Vyabhichari Bhava. In normal life, these bhavas or Vyabhichari bhavas gives us pleasure or pain. But while we experience a literary work, we often are enjoying these bhavas and Vibhava, and Vyabhichari bhava. The next thing Krishnamurti mentions is style. While the above findings are applicable in their entirety to drama, which is a composite art made up of several elements like music, dance, painting, and histrionics, more formal structural analysis is required as a supplement to give us a complete idea of the art of poetry. So, according to Krishnamurti, the above mentioned Rasa Sutra and Bhava Vibhava, Anubhava, and Vabhichari Bhava, everything explains the aesthetics behind drama. But to understand poetry, we need something more, something which is very specific. And that's where style comes to play. So, criticism is more of a formal type. So, they focus on mainly forms. And this may be set out as follows: poets, rasavesha, are is always greater than kavya. Rasa of reader is simple, Vaidarbhi to ornate body. The techniques are Riti, Marga, Bandha, Rachana, Samgatna, Vritti, including use of samas of sound, form, shabda, and sense, content, artha. Figurative alamkara, qualitative guna, and figurative alamkara. The figurative alamkara are alliteration, anupras alankar, chime, yamak alankar, and pun, slash alankar. The qualitative guna and the mixture of qualitative and figurative is vigor, ojas, alankar, sweetness, madhurya alankar, lucidity, prasad alankar, etc. And the figurative ornate alankars are simile, upma, metaphor, Rupaka Alankar, hyperbole, Atishayokti Alankar, and paradox, Virodhi Alankar. So the Alankars are divided into two forms according to Krishnamurti. One is Shabdalankar and other is Arthalankar. So in Shabdalankars, there are only figurative Alankars, naming alliteration, yamak, chime Alankar, and pun, slash Alankar, and etc. And in Arthalankars, there is Ojas Alankar, Madhurya Alankar, Prasad Alankar. In qualitative subdivision, while in figurative division, there is simile, Upama Alankar, metaphor, Rupak Alankar, hyperbole, Atishayokti Alankar, and paradox. So next he talks about guna, literary qualities. So one second.
What happened?
So I lost the thread. Let's go.
We are discussing Alankaras, right? On page 329. Aren't we?
Yes, sir, yes. So in guna Alankar, achieved by conscious and deft techniques involving selection and arrangement into rhythmic patterns of syllables, short and long compounded words, sentences, etc., with an eye to their sweetness or harshness, sincerity or pedantry, not only in respect to sound effects but also sense effects. The qualitative considerations are significantly termed guna of Shakta and Artha as well. Their number is usually given as 3, but some theorists mention as many as 10. Some take them as rooted in sound and sense only, namely Dandi. Others opine that they belong to style, namely Vamana. A few hold that they are really properties of rasa, though they appear to be of sound and sense. Example is Anandavardhan. Still, others find them inherent in nature of the creative poet. But all are agreed on the point that they form the most significant and conspicuous ingredient of style, accounting for its clearly discernible variation, like the delicate and the ornate. So each might be appealing in its own way. Originally, the two styles were named after regions, namely the North, Gaudi, Gaudi, and South, Vaidarbhi. Gaudi and Vaidarbhi. But later they were renamed Sukumar and Vichitra. A happy mixture of the two was recognized as a third known as Panchali or the middle, Madhyama. In critical judgment, the former was usually held to be the more natural and spontaneous, and hence more appealing than the later, achieved by great labor. The words marga, bandha, samghatna, vritti, rachna, etc. are more or less synonyms of riti, interpreted broadly as systematic arrangement. The next is alankaras, as we know, are figures of speech. They are things like simile, talks one as another, metaphor, fancies non-existent comparisons, utpreksha, and indulges in freely in exaggeration, atishayokti. It means two or more things simultaneously, shlesha, rebels in paradox, virodha, notices strange and minute aspects of everything in nature, svabhavokti. It overturns logic and reverses the roles of cause and effect, vibhavana, and makes impossible things possible, asamgati. It adduces parallels between remote objects, drishtana, gives telling illustration, nidarshana, and indulges in strange generalization, arthantaranyasa, doubt, sandeha, remembrance, smaran, and even illusion, bhranti, become delectable. It juxtaposes incompatibles, visama, and applauds by censuring Vyaja, Vyajatsutti. It overtly speaks of irrelevant subjects like birds and beasts, while it covertly means something else, most relevant. Anyukti. It uses epithets with special significance, parikar, and even adopts word patterns like chain, shrinkla, iteration, mala, respective reference, yatha samkhya, yatha samkhya, and so forth. These are so many devices thought invented by a creative mind as the natural medium for poetry. The importance of guna vis-a-vis alankar is self-evident. The guna are more intrinsic to poetry because they are intimately bound up with rasa, while alankar are like external ornaments. Hence, while the imagery of alankar is extremely desirable in poetry, so long as they appear as spontaneous effusions of a creative genius suffused with rasa, they become sources of revulsion when indulged in excess because their artificiality is then obvious and they mar rasa. So this is similar to what Wordsworth said as well about using normal language to write poetry instead of using elaborate and ornamental language and diction to write poetry. And only the poetry written in its spontaneity can become more impactful to the readers. And it is very similar to what Krishnamurti here says as well about how uh, guna is more important in relation to rasa. The next part, judgment of literature, will be covered by Khadija. So over to you, Khadija.
Hello. Yeah. So I will begin with judgment of literature. Now, the first point in that is defects, which basically means dosa, like a dosa, and like today we call it dosh. So it's basically defects. So one second. Yeah, so it's defects. So it is an important concept in classical tradition of literary criticism or Sanskrit criticism. So defects means like the rules or the discipline of the literary work has not been followed properly. And like anything else, there are possibilities of defects in any kind of literary work. So sometimes these defects are mentioned as negations of gunas, uh, but the writer or the poet can change it and make it look aesthetically pleasing. So now usually the defects are brought divided under five categories, which is a word, part of a word, sentence, subject, and rasa. Now it the he says in that essay that the determination of dosas demand a high degree of literary sensibility in the critic. Now, as they are divided into five categories, uh, each category has each category has subcategories of the dosas. So, in the first one, which is the word, dosh like dissonance, obscenity, improper denotation, vulgarity, lack of full significance, ambiguity, wrong meaning, forced meaning. These are the common defects of word. Similarly, he says that harsh syllables, deleted or changed syllables, or shortage in words, and other faults like obscenity and loss of euphony, wrong order of the placement of the words. These are all categorized under the compound words, and they are said to be other defects that might violate sentences. Then there are other defects as absence of significance, disorder, vulgarity, obscurity, illogicality, opposite sense, ambiguity, misinterpretation of the facts, or incompleteness, or reversal of orders. So these are the general or erroneous presentation of particular as general and vice versa. These are the defects of meaning, means the earth of the poetry or any work. So basically, it is observed that these errors are basically found in the grammar, syntax, and composition of the poetry. And according to the Sanskrit literary criticism, these are all classed as defects. Uh, and in their very nature, they represent the highest classical standard attainable in all respects. So when the poet needs to find the dosas in his poem or in his poetry, and he needs to work on them. So now it says that while the defects mentioned earlier uh, are only found in individual parts of a poem, but impropriety in the delineation of rasa or bhava marks the work as a whole. So there are certain shortcomings, such as stating the intent in rasa by name instead of suggesting it in the proper way, then elaborating the accessories of a rasa, then rendering the comprehension of vibhavas, then untimely elaboration or attenuation of rasa, treatment of the same rasa over and over again, lack of sufficient attention given to the dominant rasa, violation of the canons governing different types of characters, attribution of wrong traits to the subjects. Now, as I said earlier, that these flaws or these defects are going to be there in a poetry or in a poem, but they should not be forgotten. So it says that with proper discretion, a poet can remove these defects and turn them into something positive, turn them into something aesthetically pleasing. Uh, so when a character is swayed by a sudden burst of passion or wonder, he can found the rules of propriety, and so forth. Now, poets are indeed encouraged to adopt freely in their works certain poetic conventions, which are called kavi samayas. Uh, Now, these Kavi Samayas are briefly indicated under convenient heads, particularly those relating to the earth, ignoring the ones about heaven and the netherworld. So, there are a certain points given describing non-existing things as existing, and then the example is given that lotuses bloom in all rivers, swans reside in all waters, mountains contain gems, cobras contain gems in their heads, etc. Then existing things are described as non-existent, like malati flower do not bloom in spring, sandal trees do not have flower and fruit, ashoka trees have no fruit. Then restricting the existing existence of the things to certain localities. Pearls are found in the river Tamraparni. Sandal trees are found only in Malaya mountain. Then abstract ones treated as concrete, like darkness can be pierced by a needle, moonlight can be filled in a jug. Then inventions of fancy, and the example is the kakora bird subsists only on moonbeams. The kakravaka gets separated from its mate at night, and examples like that. So these conventions are taken from the myths provided by the Purans, and uh, it has and then the poet has given it an atmosphere of unique grandeur to turn it into classic Sanskrit poetry. And these kind of figures of speech or this kind of metaphors and comparisons, they have kind of become cliches of all Indian literature. Like they have been following since then, and they are still available to us today. So the next part is gradations of beauty in literature. So poetic beauty is a complex made up of several elements. So some elements relate to the form, some to content, some to style, and it also sometimes differ from one poet to another. And there are several manifestations of beauty, such as first, sensuous beauty of sublimity perceived in the objects of nature, then beauty of sublimity in men's emotions and actions. And the example is Asarya Saundarya, beauty inherently present in the poet's raw material, sound or sense. Sahaja, beauty and technique adopted by a poet. Aharya, beauty in the creative imagination of a poet. Bhavikatva. Uh, then Bhasa says that beauty is that which pleases all. While Kalidas and Bhairavi agree that inherent beauty needs no decoration. Kalidas adds that the beauty in outer objects may not always delight you, and maybe he suggests that the inner beauty is what matters more, or inner beauty is what you should see instead of the beauty of the outer object. So, so now we come to Megha's final description of beauty as that which retains its freshness of charm every time it is viewed. Now we come to the next, or maybe one of the most important category, which is the dhwani. Now, dhwani, the concept of dhwani was introduced by Anand Vardhan, and dhwani theory is the semantic theory. Now, semantic is a branch of linguistics studying the meaning of the words. Uh, Now, rasa theory is an affective theory, and similarly, the dhwani theory is a semantic theory, which results from the emotions. Now, poetry is basically a verbal icon or a verbal structure. As such, there cannot be any poetry without words, right? So this means that we cannot have any discussion about poetry without semantics. Now, as I said, that it was Anand Vardhan which brought the Dhwani theory into existence. There are no doubt that the charming features in each, uh, I'm sorry, okay, Dhwani is a higher kind of beauty because it is grasped to the higher level of sensitivity on the part of the connoisseur after he has ceased attending to beauties of forms and contents for their own sake. Now, the ordinary features or functions of a language, which is primary denotation, secondary implication, and even purport of a sentence as a whole, after constructing the words properly, becomes the means to serve the ultimate end of manifesting dhwani. Now, dhwani, one second. Now, dhwani, Anand Vardhana has said that Dhwani is the essence or the soul of the poetry. Any body of poetry can be scientifically analyzed by knowledge of grammar, the dictionary, prosody, phonetics, etc. But Dhwani is the soul, which is directly felt by the cultured and the sensitive readers of the poetry. Now, the range of Dhwani is so vast that it doesn't only cover all aspects of beauty, but goes far beyond it. Uh, in the entire world of nature and human thought, can be described as Vastu, which means the subject, and Vastu suggested in poetry is just one branch of Dhwani. Emotions and feelings can never be evoked in any other way than suggestion. And therefore, Anandvardhana suggests that every word used in a poem has two kinds of meaning. One is the primary, and the second is uh, the primary meaning and the primer. The primer meaning, which by that he suggests the meaning which is implicit or indirect, or which the user has to understand on his own, and that is known as dhwani. Now the credit for okay, one second. Okay, the credit for having provided room in the wide aesthetic analysis of rasa, not only for the beautiful but also the sublime, the grand, the comic, the ugly, and the pathetic, cannot be denied to Sanskrit theorists. Everything is grist to the poet's mill, and even the ugly and the repulsive can be transformed by the art of poetry into aesthetic experience. By this, he says that poetry has to evoke emotions in the readers, and the verbal structure of a poetry which doesn't have any emotions doesn't that kind of poetry doesn't deserve to be called poetry, because a poet can turn the ugly like he can turn the ugliness into art, and it can bring aesthetic experience to us as well if it is if he portrays it using his imagination, his creative imagination. So the whole gamut of aesthetic experience is thus very sensitively transversed, and the crown being reserved for spiritual ecstasy or santa, which may be described as passionless passion or endless, boundless calm. Uh, Abhinav Gupta went to extent of recognizing Sant as the manuscript of all the other rasas, and Bhavabhuti seems to suggest that pathos deserve the pride of place. Bhoja declares that all embracing subjective ego's self-regard comes to be technically termed Shringar, and hence it should be regarded as a source of all other rasas. Now, on deeper, okay, one second. Okay, so now in the best of first grade poetry discussed above, though we have stressed the dominance of rasa as vital, but the invariable companion of suitable gunas and alankars shouldn't be ignored, because if the rasa is the soul of a poetry, then gunas and alankars constitute the very body of poetry. Now there cannot be, he says that there cannot be a soul without a body. Now all elements of structure beauty must become subordinate in order to let the aesthetic rasa have free play. Now the literary masterpieces in Sanskrit literature can be brought under the first or the second of the classes of poetry. There would still remain a vast body of literary work unaccommodated under them. Uh, then these laborious lucubrations of boring experts teeming with tedious verbal exercises and riddles would, strictly speaking, fall outside the purview of poetry. But for courtesy's sake, they may be given the lowest place, what called Sitra, or yes, Sitra, when Asian, but this does not entitle the modernist to be recognized as a poet. And then it says that, uh, okay, one second. Okay, it says that Dhwani theory is an established system of literary criticism in Indian poetry, which includes all the existing principles such as guna, riti, alankar, and vritti. And it makes it an integrated system of literary excellence and enables the aesthetic outcome called rasa, which means that the dhwani, like there is an adoption of like dhwani will enable one to grade literary works and attempt applied criticism by providing a workable yardstick not only for evaluating short poems but even for evaluating the whole epics and plays. Now come the pratibha, which is basically creative imagination of the poet. So it follows from the above consideration that Indian criticism makes heavy demands on the poet's creative originality or creative imagination. However, tried this borrowed theme be in the making of a poet, pratibha or creative imagination is always given the highest importance. As I said, as I also mentioned earlier. Uh, in one second. Okay. Um, it has been said that no known sage can be deservingly called poet. A sage will be worth his name only by virtue of his vision. By vision, we mean the insight into truth and about all the manifold objects in the world and their varying states. So basically, it tries to say that until and unless you have a creative imagination and you bring something pleasant out of it, you cannot be called a poet. And one second. Okay. And now he gives the example of Valmiki that even though he had great vision and clear vision, but he did not become a poet until and unless he embodied that vision into an epic, as we know, which is Ramayana. Now comes the point Sahardaya, which is critic with literary uh, taste. In order to now it says that in order to be receptive enough to such rare creation of poetic pratibha. Uh, okay, so like to have creative imagination, it goes without saying that and rare gift of sensibility and good taste has to be there in the critic. That is why Anandvardhana insists on reminding us that the doctrine of Dhwani is a document based on felt aesthetic experience of Sahardayas or critics with good taste. Abhinav Gupta goes a step further and says that the identity in the natures of the gifted poet declares the essential identity in the nature of the gifted poet and the gifted critic. He says that the Sahardaya means one with the kindred heart, but he would prefer to think that the spirits of the ideal poet and the ideal literary critic are one and the same. Uh, Okay, so he says that it is the task of more gifted souls. By gifted souls, he means the poet, like he explained, one with a kindred heart. Like the poet has to have a gift of imagination and creativity, with the help of which he would bring out aesthetic taste. Now, defense of poetry and criticism. Now in this, there are like he has mentioned two epics, as we all know, Ramayana, Mahabharata, which are valued highly as popular and pleasing representations of the ethical codes laid down in law books. Um, but like he says that these are the epics and like they contain a very high, like they have high status. But soon secular poetry grew, and that added a sensuous dimensions, which became more popular. And uh, this aroused serious protest from orthodox philosophers, such as Raj Shekhara, sums up their objections in the Kavya Mimamsa. That poetry, okay, so he was orthodox philosopher who says that poetry should not be taught because it teaches untruth, it teaches immorality, and it abounds in obscenity. His line of defense, however, is far from convincing because he merely refers to the point that even the Vedic scriptures are tainted with these very blemishes. But there is another name mentioned here, Bhattatortam. He gives an effective rejoinder and says that there is no real existence of sense objects uh, at all in the world of poetry because it is an imaginary one. Now, then can you complain that possessions are profoundly excited by poetry? Now, this reminds me of the sentence by, I guess it was Aristotle, that my poetry is twice removed from origin. Okay, sorry, I forgot it. Let it be. So I'll go forward with it. Although I know the what I'm going to say, but I can't like articulate it. So now he talks of aesthetic experience. He says that if you should say that aesthetic experience is passion, you fail to distinguish once again between aesthetic emotion and sexual passion. If you persist in holding that the vicious effect proves the viciousness of the cause, we have only to ask you back how a character like Sita can ever be an object for the love of two or more persons. Hence, our stand is that just as dust is used to clean up a dusty mirror, passion is utilized to remove passion in the critic. Okay, I'm not able to understand this properly, but okay. So now, in addition to this claim, that immediate aesthetic joy or rasa is an end or value in itself. Standard theorists are seen stating that literature indirectly serves to help people realizing all the four recognized values of life, which is morality, dharma, material prosperity, which is earth, worldly pleasures, which is kama, and spiritual emancipation, which is moksha. So, unlike the ordinance mentioned in the law books in regard to these, which might repel the student by their dryness, literature sugarcoats the bitter pill of instruction by the way of alluring rasas, and thus eventually more effective. So, I guess this means to say that the poetry, when it is created or when it is written with imagination, it sugarcoats the bitter pill of instruction, which were there uh, which are there in the epics or classic texts, and it brings out a more like it brings out the rasas and is more pleasing or more pleasant to read. Now, such pleasing instruction literatures compared to sweet and winsome influence of the beloved Kanta Samhita. To these are added the prospects of everlasting fame, wealth, and religious merit that a poet might well aspire. Now comes the Vakrokti. Now, this has also been derived from the inspiration from the Dhuni theory. Kuntak developed his theory of Vakrati, which is oblique expression, to serve as an aid to practical criticism. Um, Now, his approach is practical, and he cannot accept the self-contradictory assertion to Anand Vardhan that rasa may be sometimes dominant when it termed dhvani and sometimes auxiliary when it is called alankar. He says that if rasa and if rasa is the soul and alankar is the body, strict logic demands that soul must perforce by always dominant and can never brook any subordination. Then Anandavardhana has admitted two type of beauty in poetry: the stated Vakya and the suggested, which is Vyangya, and recognized two classes of poetry depending on the relative preponderance of one over the other. But Kuntaka cannot accept this beauty in poetry, uh, accepted as good by discerning critics. According to him, the broadest principle which can do justice to all the categories of literary theory, including Dhvani, is Vakrati, which might admit of innumerable varieties. He says that a poem might be beautiful for more reasons than one, and it should be the task of the critic to look out for all the diverse elements that makes a poem beautiful, or which makes a poem pleasing, or which contributes to the poem's beauty. Now I come to practical criticism. So the earlier writers had mostly contented themselves with illustrating their rules. Uh, Even the few who took the trouble of selecting right examples of accepted masterpieces of literature did not attempt literary assignments of whole works. Uh, the pioneer efforts in the neglected but most important field of applied criticism by Anand Vardhan and Kuntakwa deserve a more than a passing notice here. Now the final, yes, this is the final. Yeah, two specimens. Now this talks of Ramayana Mahabharata again. That in the Ramayana Valmiki has embodied the dominant sentiment of pathos. Uh, it has indeed been maintained as predominant till the very end of the work because the poem closes the point of irreparable loss of Sita. And in the Mahabharata also, the Pandavas and the Kauravas are fighting with each other, and it will be seen that its conclusion on a note of despair consequent of miserable deaths of uh, the Kauravas as well as some of the Pandavas. And it was written by great sage Vyasa. It reveals his primary intention of preaching the moral of renunciation through his work and throws light upon the fact that intended final emancipation as the foremost of human values and calm as the most predominant sentiment in the work as a whole. Now, Kuntak on Kalidasa, now Kuntak talks about Kalidasa Shakuntala, which is also a famous literary work. Um, and then he goes on to discuss the whole story of how uh, the play Abhijana Shakuntala, like how the Shakuntala was separated from Dushyant, and Dushyant couldn't remember her because of a curse by Sage Durvasa. So Sage Durvasa is blind, and once he comes to Shakuntala's cottage, and she was sleeping, and Shakuntala did not see him coming, and then he cursed her with such words. He whom you are thinking of with such, like Shakuntala was thinking of Dushyant when the sage Durvasa entered, and she couldn't notice him. To which, like that angered him so much that he gave a curse. He whom you are thinking of with such raptness that you cannot see even me, a sage arrived. Let him not recall you, though reminded, like one drunk who cannot a statement his own. And then it goes on like there is that such a curse is flung upon Shakuntala, and then Shakuntala was on her way to meet Dushyant, but what happens is that her ring drones in the water, and that is swallowed by a fish, and it was then a fisherman, I guess, finds it and gives it to the king himself, and it goes on to describe how Dushyant found Shakuntala again, and then his memory came back, and then they were reunited again. So it says that all these epithets given to the king in suffering are full of artistic beauty. So there is artistic beauty of number in the word Gotresu, where the plural is aesthetically used to refer to the name of a single rival in love. They all add to the aesthetic appeal of the situation. So when the king, looking for the picture of his beloved, drawn by himself, speak gallantly of the sweet recollection of his love, which goes on like, "Oh, be if you dare to touch any more my darling's lip as red as bimba fruit, I shall jail you in the lotus bud." So there is some reference of a bee also in the story, which I might have missed. So that is like a bee is mentioned here. So this tells us that the speech finds a echo in the heart of the readers. And in the exquisite episode invented by the genius of the poet, but not there in the play, the unbearable fact of the king's forgetting his wife without any reason. Okay, oh, I missed. Okay, where was I? 1 second, sir. Okay, it's almost over. I was saying that if um, such a genius, like it was if this was not written with such genius, the unbearable fact of the king's forgetting his wife without any reason would become a blemish, as much in the play as in the original story of the Mahabharata itself. So it basically says that it has been written with such beautiful words and with such genius and with such grand language, which makes it look pleasing, although it might not be that pleasing. So yes, here we come to the end, and that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so that was a fairly comprehensive discussion. I think we touched upon all the important points here. So what I suggest is that all of you should read this essay because this is so basic. It explains all the basic concepts of Sanskrit poetics. So your understanding will depend on how closely you read this. Am I audible? Am I audible
Yes,
to you?
sir. Yes,
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what we'll do is tomorrow we'll have a discussion on this, and all of you are supposed to have read this and come. If you have not read, don't come, right? As simple as that. Clear? So we meet tomorrow for the class.
Yes,
yes,
sir.
sir.